Why don't I? Great, thanks. So why don't we get going? And Kristen, if you're on the phone, would you want me to just sort of dive in with agenda and all that good stuff?
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay, super. All right. So welcome everybody. This is a meeting of the steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council. And the agenda materials are in the chat. I'm happy to share my screen with them quickly, just so everybody can see what we're doing today. In addition to doing our usual administrative approval of minutes, there's a couple big conversations we have today. The first we had put on the agenda was the process for selecting steering committee membership. There are folks who are interested in stepping down. There are folks who are interested in stepping up, and there needs to be a process for that. So we wanted to spend some time, about 15 minutes, trying to figure out how to do that. And the goal there is not to select, it's the process for making that happen, which needs to be done by the council. And then we've got almost a half hour worth of time, again, to figure out a process point on the biomass recommendations. This was how we ended up in the council meeting, is that the steering committee, you all would decide on sort of how to move forward and find a way to get a set of ideas in front of the council that would address the concerns that were expressed in the council meeting. And then the final piece that we do need some time on is looking forward around next steps and the calendar going forward, which also includes sort of how to deal with revising the process document and the work plan. So that's some pieces of work that the steering committee, you all have taken on, and we just need to have a vision how this is all going to work. And also we should probably end today's meeting with an idea about the next one or two council meetings, which aren't on the books right now. We do need to leave some time for public comment. And I know we lose a bunch of folks at 10 o'clock, so we've got kind of a hard stop there. That's what we're trying to do. Any questions on the agenda before we dive into these conversations? All good? Okay, great. And for folks, just if you're joining us for the very first time for whatever reason, the steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council today consists of Liz Miller, Jared Duvall, Lauren Oates, Julie Moore, and Kristen Klauser. And we welcome all counselors to observe and be part of this conversation, but just for those who are just joining, that's who the members of the steering committee are. All right, quick then, any concerns or questions about the April 3rd minutes? Does anybody need a little bit of time to look those over?
It looked good.
Great. Any concerns from anybody about them on the steering committee? Okay. Then let's treat those as approved. Thanks so much. All right, let's dive into the next one, which is a process for selecting steering committee membership. And I'm happy to share my screen with the folks who responded to the request in serving. And this is what we got in from that form. I don't know if it's too small to see. Maybe I can make this bigger. And help me out here, folks. So today in the steering committee consists of 2 members from the administration, and that's Julie Moore and Kristen Klauser, 2 members who were appointed by the House, and that is Liz Miller and Chris Campany, who stepped away.
David Dean.
I'm not.
I replaced Chris. The speaker appointed me. This is my 3rd meeting, I think.
Okay. Okay, I have personally had some confusion about that, but that's okay. And then from the Senate appointments, Jared and Lauren are today the members. And
Do you
so,
want me to try to clarify that for a minute?
yeah, could you mind,
Yeah.
Jane?
I'll do my best. David, so you did in fact take Chris's seat on the council, but it wasn't Chris's seat that occupied the. Okay, so, and then Marion's questioning if you took Catherine's seat or David's, or Chris's seat. So regardless, it doesn't really matter. You are occupying a seat that is a counselor seat, but that seat just by default isn't a steering committee member. It was Chris himself who stepped up to be nominated to the steering committee. And so, yeah, thank you, Lauren. That's what Marion was saying to me also.
Right, and if I'll just remind, particularly the chair of the council, not only am I not a member of the steering committee, but I have not been assigned to a committee.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I think there's two members, new members of the council who do need to be assigned to a committee.
There's
And
actually three now, David.
okay,
We have a new counselor, Peter Sterling, who replaced a Senate seat, Chad Farrell.
okay,
So a lot of process happening. to
okay.
stay on top of, yeah.
So I just want to clarify then sort of what's going on. Just there are new members of the council and they require some figuring out on which subcommittee to be part of. And so that's a process step that needs to happen. On the membership of the steering committee, the current membership, we're down one because Chris Campany stepped away. And there's been some expressions of interest of folks stepping up and some expressions of interest of folks stepping down. And so what you all as a steering committee need to do is say, okay, here's our process. Let's call together a meeting of the council so that we can vote on new membership of the steering committee. And as you all have suggested, the steering committee is playing a pretty important role right now of pushing some things forward, whether it's the roadmap, process document, that kind of stuff. So it feels kind of urgent to make a pathway towards election of steering committee members by the council. So let me just suggest anybody on the steering committee, if you have a view of how this process should happen, welcome it right now. Yeah, Jared.
So I think my initial suggestion would be that after we set the next council meeting, in advance of that meeting, we share as supporting documents to be reviewed ahead of time the expressions of interest of those who've volunteered. And then we have an agenda item where there can be discussion about that, where councilors can ask questions, and then there could be a vote. At this point, it looks like there are as many interested and willing folks who've stepped forward as there are seats to House, to Senate. Unless that changes, it seems like it may be fairly straightforward. If that does change and there are other folks who would like to step forward, I think it's just best to have those expressions of interest shared ahead of time for people to review, have the opportunity for some discussion, people can ask questions, and then we just formally decide on that with a council vote.
Okay. Yep. That's great. I'm interested in the timing as well. Like, obviously, we're going to talk later in this meeting about the timing of the next council meeting. But given the role that you all have been talking about for the steering committee. I'd be interested in sort of how people are thinking on the urgency of this, and how quickly to move forward. Secretary Clauser?
So I agree. I agree with Jared in that it seems like this is something, the membership and makeup is something that we should work on fairly quickly, because my recollection is that the steering committee was tasked with kind of starting the new roadmap and procedural processes. So given that task, I don't think we should wait until the fall to sort out the membership. I think it makes sense to probably schedule this as a topic for the June meeting. And I was curious for folks who were here before. My understanding is, and we can check the roadmap for this as well, it may be laid out, but my understanding is when this came up for a vote, the House members voted for the House representatives, the Senate members voted for the Senate representatives on the steering committee, and the folks from the administration voted on the administrative representatives. So I just wanted to bring that up for discussion too. I know Jared said the whole council votes, but there may be a bit of nuance there.
I agree with what you just said, Secretary Clauser.
Right. Okay. So is it that simple? Well, and one thing that I just want to make sure is, Liz and Lauren, is it correctly implied here that you would be interested in stepping off, or is that not correctly implied here? Liz?
Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity. I expressed to Jane that if there was a lack of interest in other House members, because this takes a lot of time, obviously, as folks know. So if there was, for some reason, a lack of interest in others stepping forward from the House appointments, of course, I'd continue to serve. That's just, that's just my nature. But if there are folks who are interested, I don't have any need to stay in this position. I can remain involved in the council in many other ways. I should include in that, I see that Bram and Paula have both volunteered to step up. Bram, having the history of the last couple of years, and I know Paula coming on new. If there's any need in transition or even discrete tasks with regard to setting the, the process that we started talking about in March, that folks on the steering committee would like me to help with, I'd be happy to do that. And I could do that, I think, just, regardless of remaining on the steering committee. So I guess short version is I'm a believer in if others want to step up, then that's awesome.
Thanks, Liz. That's helpful clarification and a nice offer. Lauren?
And perhaps a bit dissimilarly, I am interested in stepping down. So I'm really pleased to see that Kelly, especially having been part of the council process from the get-go, is interested in standing in. I don't know that since there is an interest by me to step down, perhaps before a formal vote needs to take place, if she can just be a swap, or to Secretary Clauser's point earlier, if the Senate members currently on the council need to get together to approve her replacing me, whatever works, but I would like to step down as soon as Kelly is ready to step in, if that's appropriate.
Okay. Thanks, Lauren. And again, it speaks to the speed of when to have a council meeting as well, right? If it's important to finalize this, do we want to schedule up a council meeting sooner rather than later to resolve this? Okay. All right, so what I'm hearing here is let's be pretty straightforward about this. Thanks, Kelly, in the chat. let's be fairly straightforward about this and sending sort of the list of folks who've volunteered to the council. I guess, unless I'm misunderstanding here, there's 2 folks from the House and 2 folks from the Senate who've said they'd be interested in doing this. And Lauren and Liz are on varying degrees of enthusiasm to step aside. And so I'm not sure there's a decision point. There seems like, in terms of like multiple folks looking for the same seat, the council still needs to approve this. So maybe I'm missing something there, but it seems like it's pretty straightforward, as you said, Jared. Okay, great. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think last time we also provided an opportunity for writing candidates if folks felt that way. That may have just been at the point in time we were at, but I do think having it acted on by the full council makes sense.
Great. Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's do that. And then later in the meeting today, let's figure out the timing of that next council meeting. Okay, great. Anything else on that before we move on? Okay, super. All right. Now, something that's a little trickier. Next steps on the biomass recommendations. Here, just as a memory jog, and I think what's in the chat there is the updated document, has as the beginning of that document a reminder of where we ended up as a council in the last meeting, right? And where we ended up as a council in the last meeting was not comfortable moving forward with the recommendations as written, and asking you all as a steering committee to come up with a process for addressing the concerns that were expressed and figuring out how to get something else in front of the full council that would address those concerns, and at least, you know, find a pathway to approval on the council. So here, there are multiple ways to do this. You'll see in the agenda, hang on just a second, that I made a little slide about this, but it was honestly just me trying to think aloud of what would be opportunities for you all in sort of setting a process going forward. I don't know if you saw this ahead of time, but just as a flag, this is me saying, like, you know, not trying to say this is the way to do it, just saying this is the kind of thing that you could do as a steering committee, right? So for instance, you could say, okay, let's get a group of counselors together that represent sort of the diversity of the expertise in steering committees, like maybe subcommittees, maybe one person from each relevant subcommittee. They go through the comments and the concerns that were expressed, and find a way as well to help the full council understand all that input that went into the biomass deliberations, all those speakers and experts and the like. And or you all today could say, there's pieces of these recommendations that clearly should be acted on right away, even as other pieces need some more work. Let's pull those pieces out, or at least create an opportunity for the council to go sort of one by one through right away, because they need more immediate action, such as the study recommendation. So alternatively, you all, several of you as steering committee members could take a stab at incorporating comments that came across both in the meeting and afterwards, and make new drafts, right? So these are the kinds of things that could happen today and or others. So I wanted to turn it over to you all to say, how would you like to have a process to take in those concerns that were expressed both at the meeting and then afterwards, and circle back to the council with a new version or something that the council could sink its teeth into and approve or not approve. So let me stop talking and say, these are the kinds of things to talk about. what suggestions do you all have? Jared?
First, thanks for pulling this together, David, as a starting point for options to discuss. I don't have a strong preference immediately, except to say that I do have in terms of the exact process, but in terms of what ends up being presented, I do think that it's important, and I wonder if others agree, that we are able to basically assess the recommendations and vote on them as a whole. I think that I'm wary of doing it piecemeal, of pulling one piece out and voting on it while others are still being talked about. I think it makes sense for them to come together as a package, because a lot of those different recommendations influence each other and they're interactive. So I would rather see a process. I know it may take a little bit more work, probably where we try to incorporate all of the feedback and come back with one new draft that we think can achieve consensus support, so that we're doing it all at once, rather than picking one piece off and then having a longer process for some of the other recommendations. But that's just my initial reaction, because I know how interrelated some of those different recommendations were. And I think a lot of counselors, it may depend kind of on the package of recommendations as a whole, rather than kind of one by one.
Thanks, Jared. And just before I jump to David Dean, I just want to quick check in with other steering committee members, other reactions that you have when thinking about the pathway forward. Secretary Moore, and then David, I'll come back to you just in a sec.
Yeah, I just would second Jared's point that I think they were very intentionally put forward as a package, and we need to be responsive to the way the task group framed them. I really like your first suggestion, David, although might offer a friendly amendment to have a steering committee member or two join them. But I do think this is a pretty cross-cutting set of issues, and it had a lot of time and attention in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee as the task group was spun up, but I think would benefit from that kind of input from cross-sector mitigation and probably science and data, since I think they would intersect with the recommendation for future study.
Thanks. Liz, if it's okay, and grab David Dean and then come back. David, jump in, please.
I'm not a steering committee member,
That's right.
so if Liz has a point to make, let her.
Okay. Liz, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it'd be super quick. I agree as well, and like Julie's idea of maybe broadening it to a steering committee member, just so there's some continuity when this committee next takes up process. And having served on the task group, it was a more holistic process. I think at one point we considered whether, we just move forward on the kind of truly unanimous one by ones and decided not to do that. So I think it does make sense to not break them up one by one, even though perhaps consensus could be reached pretty quickly on some items. It would leave others, hanging, and therefore not be a complete way of approaching the issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, David, go ahead, please.
Okay, first off, having gotten thrown in to the middle of this, 4 months ago, and having to take a look at the history that led to the biomass report, I would like to suggest that we recruit an intern from somewhere and create a bibliography, pounding through meetings and links that do or don't work, depending on the day or the time of day and whatever. You're about to take a dramatic step, and it sure would be, I would argue, helpful to the public to be able to easily access what your base information is. So my first thought is, if we're going to do this, then we have some funds. I'm sure we can recruit an intern from one of the institutions around where you are up there, and create that bibliography. Secondly, no conclusions. That has been my objection to the report from the first day when I read it. You started with conclusions. And in a body of work that sets out, then after reaching conclusions, no further biomass, no new biomass, whatever, then you set out a series of search topics that would underwrite that conclusion. And I just not the way you can state the problem. We would like to understand if, and then run down through your statements of concern and suggest studies to address those statements of concern, but leave the conclusion out.
Okay.
That's all I'm going to say for now. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Okay, so what I'm hearing are sort of 3 or 4 ideas. One is the first suggestion about pulling a group of folks, counselors together from the different subcommittees with a steering committee member of 2 or 2 seems like the right pathway, at least for those who have spoken up so far. 2, better to keep these together as a package as opposed to trying to split things off and act on one sooner and another one later. That doesn't seem like the right path for you. So keep it together. And then these last 2 pieces around have a bibliography or some easy way for counselors and the public to access the basis of the information. Perhaps all the information that was shared with the biomass task group is a great place to start there. And then the word of warning again of careful with getting in front with conclusions if you have a study to look at something. So those are that's what I'm hearing in terms of the pathway forward. I wonder if anyone wants to put a finer point or a friendly amendment on that as a way to address the biomass issues. Any questions on what I just said? Jared, yeah, go ahead.
The only additional recommendation I would make, I think all that sounds right and good, David, is that I do think it's important to keep this process moving forward while it's fresh from the recent council meeting and then all of the folks who took the time to provide feedback. So my recommendation would be if we can get volunteers at this meeting, either members of the council or members of the steering committee who are interested to sort through that information and try to come up with a consensus kind of revised set of recommendations. It may be that there is subcommittee representation that we don't have on this call that we may want to do additional outreach to kind of round out that committee. But I think if we could set the start of it today and set that kind of process and timeline in motion, it would be good to continue focusing on this while it's kind of fresh, and especially given the kind of history of how long it took to come forward and then be decided on.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Yeah. Julie?
I know that both our task groups and our subcommittees are made up a mix of council and non-council members. I think that this particular team really should be limited to council members, given where we are in the process and the fact that we're trying to move this to incorporate it into the climate action plan, which is really the purview of councilors only.
Thanks, Dr. Moore. And it reminds me of something when we ended the meeting last time, that the stage we're at right now is to build confidence among the counselors in the content, which supports what you're saying, Secretary Moore, of like, this is counselors need to build their own confidence in what this is. Okay. Julie? Yeah.
I was just going to say, to that end, I would volunteer to be a participant in the working or the, whatever we called it. I know we had a working group previously, but
Yeah.
the team that would bring back a set of recommendations to the full council.
Okay, thanks. So before I sort of like act on what Jared's saying and Julie's offer of like, are there volunteers right now, counselors who would be interested in doing that? Let me just check if the pathway is making sense of what we're talking about. Any other reactions from steering committee members in particular? I know there's other counselors listening in as well, and I'm happy to call on you as well. But any quick reactions to the pathway on this? I want to make sure we feel comfortable about moving forward in this way.
That makes sense to me, David.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. Okay.
Is the attempt to do something before the next full council meeting? Isn't that an awfully rushed work schedule? The next meeting is
great
June
question.
24th, right?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of like, Jared, if you want to be even more specific about, timeline. My listening to you, Jared, I didn't anticipate that you thought like, oh, somehow there'll be a, some recommendation coming into the next council meeting. I think you just want to make sure like we don't lose momentum, like trying to figure out who's going to be part of this thing, and then also
Yeah, I think I was basically trying to avoid waiting to set up the committee of counselors that would work on this until the next full council meeting. I do think that, a lot of people have taken the time to read through those revisions or those recommendations to provide recommended revisions. And if we could get a working group of counselors that could kind of build on the work that you initially have done, David, I believe with Jane, in terms of getting all of that information in, seeing where there's agreement, to try to have some type of, it's probably not possible to have, maybe it is, I don't know. I wouldn't want to presume that it is possible to have a kind of revised set of recommendations ready to go before the council, but there could at least be an update on kind of, here's what we heard, where there were areas of agreement around what the concerns were in the direction that we want to, suggest revisions in. So maybe it's a two-step process where there's an update at the next council meeting, and then a vote on a, fully revised set of recommendations at a future meeting. I'm trying to avoid a scenario in which we just kind of pause for a month and don't do anything on this for a month.
Thanks for clarity, Jared. Yeah. Liz?
I just want to say this may be an area where some continuity could also be helpful. So just as with the steering committee work, anything I can do, if this is a place where, since I served on the task group and am a counselor, I can be helpful. Of course, I'm willing. I know there are others who want to jump in, but just want to put that out there.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Helpful. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I would say I think having Liz be part of this group would be really helpful as the only, I think, council member that was a consistent member of the task group. I think her participation would be enormously important.
Great. So why don't we just do a quick check of those who are present here now, whether you're a steering committee member or a counselor, but if you're a council member here now, and if you're interested in being part of this, council group, I'd be interested, in the chat or elsewhere, just let it be known that you'd be an interested participant in helping out, and think about how we get that variety of experience from the subcommittee space, whether it's ag and eco, cross-sector, science and data, just transitions, rural resilience. So those are all useful perspectives. And feel free to raise your hand now too if you'd like to volunteer. David?
Yeah, since we had started talking about volunteers, I would consider volunteering, but I want to talk about the process of actually writing something like this. And I would argue that there needs to be an author, as opposed to 7 or 8 people sitting around trying to compromise on a word. Now, I know that that's sort of a rejection of the legislative process, but that we're not the legislative process. We're an advisory group, and it is of import that what we say with clarity. And that means a voice, not a bunch of voices, in terms of putting a message out there. So if it's going to be 6 or 8 members writing something, I'm not interested in being part of that. I am interested in supporting an author to put together a report.
Okay. Yeah, an interesting point, and I think it's something that, you know, you all as a steering committee can talk about right now, and also that group. I think in practice, what ends up happening is that things are discussed, someone goes back, does some writing, shows it back to the group, things are adjusted in real time. That's sort of the dynamic that ends up happening. But I welcome folks' thoughts on that. Also, other counselors who would be interested in being part of this, just shout out now. And Jane, I imagine probably will be sending out a note to this to get some interest and figure out if we can get that group up and running before the next council meeting. Okay. I'm not seeing a ton of hands go up, just as FYI.
If I could,
Yeah, briefly, Dave. Yeah.
I really would like the chair or someone filling as a delegate for the chair, select the people. And I don't say that to keep anyone out, but I would hope that the people can work together, have some kind of history with each other. You know, a whole bunch of trust issues getting jumped past immediately. And you know, the chairs, the co-chairs of this group know everybody here and well. Just a suggestion.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So I
I
do
can
want
just
to
make a friendly amendment, David. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
I totally hear your point, David, and agree from an kind of a workflow perspective that there's a point in the process in which all of the feedback just needs to go through one person's pen into a revised document for folks to consider. And I trust that that's what we're referring to. I also trust that the group that will be assembled will do their best to reflect on and try to incorporate to the greatest extent practicable the feedback that was provided, especially in those areas where there was real consensus. There might be a wording difference, and that's just kind of a style choice, perhaps, in terms of how to incorporate ideas that were broadly similar, even if the language was slightly different. And of course, there will have to be choices made where there was not consensus. But I would hope that the group that is assembled sees their job as not just kind of writing the report that they think needs to be written, but does the best job to reflect the kind of will and consensus that was heard both in the feedback on the first council call and then the 9 written submissions that came in.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Yeah. Jane or Marion?
Just wanted to flag, we're happy to support counselors volunteering in the process for that, but like there's additional guidance needed.
I'm sorry, you're coming through very, very garbled.
Yeah, unfortunately, your audio is a little dodgy right now. I don't know what happened, Jane.
Marion, can you hear me better now?
Sort of, but not really.
One more try. Is that
Yeah,
better?
that's better.
Okay, good. So quickly, we're happy to support a process in having counselors lean into this work, but I think there's two important components to flag first. I think the basic premise, of course, is that the group would have to be under quorum size for a council meeting. So that's one consideration, and except, of course, if you choose to have these as public meetings. So I think that guidance right out of the gate should be explicit from the steering committee about having these as public meetings or working sessions. And then two, I think there should be clear guidance around how the representation flows up from subcommittees. So are we talking about one counselor representative of all 5 subcommittees? Are we talking about one counselor from the 4 subcommittees that were originally on the task group? A little bit more guidance so that as people lean in or as we need to reach out to people to lean in would be helpful. And then second, I'll just say I flagged this in the chat. We haven't actually walked through the contract that we now have put forward in the framework with Consensus Building Institute. But the way that David's time and his colleagues' time is parsed out is directed to the council and the steering committee. And then additional time from CBI if needed, if you all feel it's needed to help facilitate an outcome with a group of counselors, would need to be an affirmative action from the steering committee to consider how we delegate CBI's time in this process, understanding it's a limited capacity with the contract, and we're trying to, rather than just sort of put resources where we see fit, have the steering committee acknowledge this is a priority for work planning and therefore needs additional capacity through facilitation.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So three concepts there. One is, and the first two are related. One is about the structure of that group, and do we want to be more explicit about that? And also more explicit about, are we trying to make these publicly noticed meetings or are they sort of internal discussion meetings? And the final piece is about just the steering committee, you all saying explicitly, yes, dedicate some time, CBI, to this effort. This would be time well spent. So steering committee members, just some quick hits on those, quick reactions to those questions. Lauren?
I'll probably only respond to the time well spent piece. I have a suspicion that I'm not the only one who has a bit of biomass fatigue by this point in time, and I wasn't even a member of the task group. I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we adopted the climate action plan in December of 2021. So it's been a year and a half since the council charged the task group with coming up with the recommendations, since we couldn't come to consensus but before our December deadline back then. So it's been going on for a year and a half. Secretary Moore mentioned that Liz was one of the only, if not the only, standing council member that was in that group consecutively over this time. And now that we're asking it to only be a council member led effort, which I don't disagree with, I just want to acknowledge the amount of time and energy that so many volunteers put into, you know, multiple, I mean, dozens of meetings, not to mention all of the work that went on behind the scenes. I don't know how, I mean, when you look at like the emissions portfolio and the impact to our economy and all of the things that we should be thinking of as like a 30,000 foot view around climate action, the footprint of biomass and the importance of the focus time. I just want to acknowledge that we as a council have spent an incredible amount of time working around this issue, not making much progress. In the future, if we're to have task groups, I think we shouldn't ask so much time of volunteers if it's just going to end up being a council determined effort anyway. So I don't think it's, I personally don't think it's a good use of public resources, state resources, to continue to have a long drawn out process around how we're going to come to hopeful consensus, but perhaps not even consensus around this very small part of a much larger climate action conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Lauren. Other views about these specific issues of the structure? Kristen?
So I just want to, I guess, somewhat directly address some of Jane's comments, and incorporating a little bit of what Lauren said. To the second comment, what the makeup should be of this group, I do think it's one counselor from each subcommittee. I say that in order to just kind of focus this work, because this really is step two, right? That the task force, everyone has been working really hard to bring recommendations to the council, and those recommendations were rejected. So this is now the piece where comments are incorporated to see if it can get to consensus, but I do think this is a much smaller sliver of the overall work that folks have done here. So creating a large group to try and incorporate those comments and refocus, I think would not be time well spent.
Okay. Thanks, Kristen. Bram?
A couple of people have said consensus, and I'd just like to note that it seems to me very unlikely that the council will achieve consensus on biomass, given how contentious it is and how diametrically opposed various people's views are of it. So I just want to be realistic about whether the goal is consensus or whether the goal is majority support, and whether majority support is an acceptable goal.
Thanks, Bram. That's right. Glad you said that. Julie?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts here. I mean, I appreciate what Lauren's saying in terms of balance and overall finite hours to invest in process. I think this probably is a nice segue into the conversation about the process roadmap. I don't know that we had a clear vision when we established task groups for sort of how to best direct the scope of their work, or what we as a council would intentionally do with their findings once they were received and returned to us. And so now we're sort of building that part of the plan as we go along, and recognizing that's far from ideal. I made several pleas, and this will come as a surprise to no one, I suspect, about the effort needed to set overall priorities for the work of the council. Seeing Jane and Jared both reflect in the comments that they don't necessarily have the capacity to spend a lot of time in this space right now. I think we do owe it to the task group members to sort of get this to a place where the council can act on it. But I also think we really need to dig into that process roadmap and make sure we're clearly articulating council priorities, so that we don't end up with people who clearly have a lot of passion for this issue and interest in this issue, spending time on something that doesn't align well with the overall priorities of the council.
Great. So in that spirit, we do need to switch to that conversation quickly, or else we're going to run out of time. David, last word here, and then I'm going to do a quick pulse check on some very specific issues to close out this conversation. David?
Okay, I agree. Keep the group small, keep the effort at what is absolutely minimum to be effective. And in terms of what I tried to do with my rewrite of that publication, do the studies. I think we can all agree that we want to have that information prior to reaching any kind of conclusion. Just authorize the studies, or make a recommendation to the council to authorize the studies. And I have no idea what resources are available. And maybe that needs to be tempered, but I think we already have agreement on a lot of stuff.
Thanks, David. Okay, just to make sure there's some conclusion on this conversation, and also to Jane's sort of more practical questions. So I'm hearing that it sounds like this is, a member of each subcommittee, and then an additional steering committee member or two, that sort of keep it lean, but keep it with that diversity of membership.
David, sorry, just friendly. I don't think it needs to be an additional steering committee member, just so long as, like, if Julie or Liz, are representing science and data or cross-sector mitigation, I think that suffices. I think it was a good point that was brought up earlier of keeping the link to the steering, so that there can be a report back in terms of next steps. But I don't think those need to be additional seats, just making sure that someone among those 5 is a member of the steering committee would be helpful for process.
Thanks for the clarification. That's helpful, Jared. Yeah. In terms of, Liz, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd rather see, like, for example, if I'm going to be helpful as continuity, I'd rather see someone else from cross sector, for example, you know what I mean, who might have been offering comments and amendments since I did sit through the process. That might be more helpful to move it forward,
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, by definition, I supported bringing the draft to the council as a part of that process, despite the fact that there wasn't unanimity. So having another voice from cross sector as an example could be helpful.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a need, though, at the back end of this meeting for Jane to make a communication out to the full council saying, this is the plan. We are open to volunteers with this kind of criteria of stepping up. And if there's a need for some selection among those volunteers, it sounds like we're gonna have to call you all back as a steering committee to help us sort out how to make that work. Because I hate to have, like, Jane and myself be the ones in charge of figuring that out.
David, that's why you have a chair.
Yeah, through the chair of the council.
You vest somebody or 2 somebodies with certain authorities, and putting together a rewrite committee, if that's what you might call it, certainly would fall under the role for a chair.
So with David's comments there, for steering committee members, are you comfortable having Kristen as the chair be the one who, if there's any questions about the composition of this group, that Kristen can make those decisions? Just to expedite this? Does that work for folks? Any concerns about that? Yeah, Julie's got a thumbs up. Okay, excellent. Super. All right, and then the final piece or the 2 final pieces, any concerns about CBI investing our time in this as well? Again, you as a steering committee have the ability to direct the resources CBI towards the different pieces of the council you feel are most appropriate. Any concerns about having CBI can invest resources in this particular effort? Would folks rather invest those or save those resources for later? Lauren?
I mean, what level of resources are we talking about? Like, are we giving, like, we have 2 more meetings and that's our deadline, and CBI is going to help facilitate those 2 meetings, and at the end of it, we're either agreeing to vote yes or no as a council, or push to the next climate action plan, which actually isn't that far away. I would be opposed to just kind of saying direct CBI to continue talking about biomass without any type of limitation on either like financial or time amount, because it's been far too much and far too long from my perspective already.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. How does that sound to folks? That yes, it's a yes, but, right? Yes, but let's really just focus on getting this efficiently done in the near term. And if that's not the case, then it's probably not great to invest resources. Yeah. Okay. Super. All right. And Jane, do you need an answer right now in terms of these being publicly noticed meetings or not?
Well, no, I mean, if we don't plan to meet till after the next council meeting, which isn't scheduled yet, then that's fine with me.
Okay, Jared?
I would just suggest, for sake of efficiency, that if we know that there are folks who have an interest and a commitment to this process from certain subcommittees, that we could just decide on right now, and then we're really looking just to fill the remaining seats. I mean, it sounds like Secretary Moore has volunteered and she's on the Science and Data Subcommittee. Rather than, pulling the full Science and Data Subcommittee, I think just kind of having her be that subcommittee member makes sense. And I think it would be good just to pause to see if there are other counselors on this call who want to be part of moving this process forward. I really appreciate Liz's willingness, given her continuity throughout, and I think could be that steering person. But I just didn't want this to end without being able to surface that, to see if we had a starting point of a working group rather than just kind of starting from scratch after this.
Thanks, Jared. Are there folks that want to step up right now? We've heard from Liz, Julie, David Dean said potentially.
I can represent Just Transitions if needed,
Okay,
and it sounds like that might be needed.
yeah.
And I would be willing to represent cross-sector if that is needed.
Okay. Great. Okay. So we're getting a group together, and I think just the question mark in my mind for you all steering committee, I know there's maybe people who feel quite interested in this issue, like Paula or others, who may raise her hand if she had the chance, right? So I want to make sure we let folks have the ability to raise the hand, and then if Kristen is empowered to help make that final thing come together, then we can treat that as our mechanism to make it work. All right. Okay. Anything else on this issue before we move on to the final piece of sort of looking ahead, next council meeting dates, work plan, how to work on the process document? Anything on the biomass piece before we move on? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so this final piece is around thinking ahead and how the work gets done. Jane, you had some slides on this, if I remember correctly, as a way of sort of setting the scene. Do you want to walk through those slides?
Sure, I'm happy. I supported putting these together. Happy to do that for you, David, or have you use them, but I can do it quickly if that's helpful.
Yes, probably best from you, and then I'm happy to do the very end of it if you want me to.
Okay. I'll start by saying that I put the first two slides back into this presentation, not to go through right now in detail, but because they have been helpful in the past as reminders for you all to think about work planning and obligations, but just as a resource to reflect on for today's conversation. So again, I'm going to move quickly through them, mindful of time, and then hit the comments that really elevated out of the conversation at the in-person meeting in March. So the first slide really is just a reminder about the council's ongoing statutory obligations and the work that's in progress and work that is ongoing. The second slide was a conversation that just started to highlight administrative gaps and challenges and a role of A&R versus the facilitation contract. And I might encourage us, just as we continue to think about this, like I did today, just to remember that there are these gaps, that the facilitation services are here to help for quite a bit, but the discretionary sort of application of those really lies between the Agency of Natural Resources, who manages that contract, and the steering committee really trying to be affirmative in where we direct those resources. There were complaints, challenges from counselors in the past that the distribution of CBI was not equitable across subcommittee and task groups. So really trying to put that in the hands of the steering committee now going forward through an articulation of what work priorities look like. So a reminder in the minutes that Catherine and CBI helped put together after the March meeting, There was an articulation of where the priorities are for the council in the coming year and a half as we move into the revision to the climate action plan that is not due until July 1st of 2025, and really trying to articulate what the role of the council is in this sort of interim time. And then, of course, think about what's sort of still coming from the last plan and needs to be finished. So you all said at the meeting that you really wanted to develop a work plan up front and really try to prioritize the tasks based on that capacity we just spoke to, budget, and then of course, time of counselors and time and resources from A&R. And of course, other state government, I should say, because this is not just about A&R, other state government has been contributing resources too, of course. There was an interest from you all to look at both the IPCC as well as the GWSA to think about criteria to prioritize those that work plan as well. There was a re-articulation, as you continue to speak to, about public engagement and the need to build trust, especially building up to the next plan. You've heard from David and CBI about the work that A&R is doing through the contract with CBI and the work that will continue to update and speak to the council on the progress we're making in that space. Continue to amplify the importance of adaptation and resilience. How do we bring that up to be equal and accountable with respect to the work we're also doing for mitigation? And then, of course, focusing on the most vulnerable and most impacted to keep equity front and center. The next four that are highlighted here, I've shown in orange largely to articulate that as we start to do a better job of communicating the work of the Climate Action Office, I think that we will be able to demonstrate that this is work that the Climate Action Office is doing and can be more of a report out to the Climate Council and hear from you all as an advisory council in this space to us. But I just wanted to flag it as I see it a little different, these next four. But of course, you all may choose to prioritize it in a way that is separate from the Climate Action Office. But I see these four as the sort of key components of some of the work the Climate Office is doing over the next year. So we are putting together a way to monitor progress on implementation of the CAP. We'll be able to report out how we're doing that to you all in the coming months. We've been thinking about how to unpack the climate action plan and make it more interpretable, easy for decision makers to actually pursue, especially when we're thinking about the role of state government in the climate action plan. And we hopefully, by doing all of that, are thinking about how we're communicating what work we're already moving forward and where we haven't actually taken action yet. Additional priorities that have emerged when you all broke into small groups that we didn't have a chance to come back and really report out to all of you on because public comment took a while at the in-person meeting. But there's still obviously the work of the biomass task group did come up as a clear priority and the interest in seeing that as an addendum to the original climate action plan and not sort of stalled on until the next plan. There's this interest to revisit all the aspects of the process roadmap. We have that link today, and David can reflect the work that he's done to sort of look across the process roadmap and highlight clear spaces that need revisions, need to be clear, like totally overhauled, and areas that were gaps from the first document. Prioritize the council's work over the next 2 years using quantitative and qualitative criteria. That sort of gets back to that original comment on the first screen about a need to think about how we really prioritize, not only based on the GWSA, but also the IPCC guidance. Update data as needed, the ongoing work of science and data, and then of course, continuing to report to the legislature on an ongoing basis as we do every January. So what does this all suggest? What I feel like I'm taking away and we'll put forward for you all to discuss that we've set the steering committee meetings now to be monthly. Those are all on your calendar now. A lot of this work is process driven and does feel like the steering committee can have this sort of more impactful role in that space over the next year. The Climate Council does not have any upcoming meetings. As a starting place, I'm proposing to you quarterly with the next meeting in June. But if there's work to be done by the biomass group, we may want to push that out a bit, but that's all for you to decide. The work of subcommittees has been really varied. And I would, encourage that discretion can be given to them as much as you all see fit to move on items in support of whatever the work plan is you put forward. And some meet regularly and some don't, and that seems fine. But you can discuss. And then task groups, we've really been scaling back, but continue to engage them as needed. So Marion meets actively with the Climate Municipal Action Toolkit task group, because that's an active project and it is a good way to get cross fertilization input on that tool from across subcommittees and different perspectives. The same is true for the Municipal Vulnerability Index. So we're still using them, but I don't see it as a productive sort of long-term group management for us, because it is a lot of additional work for us, and we'd prefer to see subcommittees tapped going forward.
Okay. So we're a little crushed on time because I know that we want to leave some time for public comment as well. There's really important things to decide. One is, do you want to set the council meetings right now? Based on everything, particularly the next council meeting, but perhaps the next two or so. And two is, there's work to get done around creating a work plan, updating the process document, and that work needs to happen somehow with the steering committee. And so how to make all that happen. So knowing we have a hard stop, I just want to, we're going to make time for public comment, even if we run a little late, but, quick decisions from steering committee about the next council meeting, which is needed to finalize a new steering committee composition. Do folks have a sense, like, do you want to do it right now, June 12th kind of thing? Is there a quick proposal on the table that you all could agree on right now before we finish up at the top of the hour? Does anybody feel strongly, right? So if you really wanted to move more quickly on the steering committee, you could make a council meeting on June 12th, for instance, or even June 5th. So does anybody have a strong feeling about that in the steering committee? Okay. Jane, do you have a strong feeling about it? Like if we were to set a council meeting on June 12th, something like that?
No.
Okay.
No strong feeling.
Okay, great. Does anybody have concerns, just in the spirit of getting it done right now? Like, does anybody have concerns that we set our next council meeting for June 12th, and that will be the time to do the steering committee thing and any update on how the biomass is moving forward? And if you all want to talk about how you want to do your own work planning and things like that, you could do it there too. Any concerns about June 12th for that purpose? Okay.
Nope.
Okay, great. Well, let's say that, and quarterly seems like the pathway that makes sense to folks for the council. Jared?
David, I just want to also recommend that on the agenda for that June 12th meeting, we add assigning new counselors to subcommittees so that David and Paula and Peter have that clarity, especially if we're only going to be doing council meetings quarterly. I feel like we need to do that. So my suggested process there would be, I don't know if I would defer to you, Jane and David, the kind of division of labor in the process here, but I think it would be important to ask those three folks about their preferences in terms of their areas of interest and expertise and where they want to serve. And then ideally, it's just kind of appointing them to the subcommittees that they most want to serve on. We may want to just kind of look at balance and composition and kind of need, but if we could add that to the next council agenda on June 12th, kind of formally approving that. I mean, it could also happen at a subcommittee meeting, but I think it would be
Or steering committee meeting, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, steering committee. But I think it could also be a good kind of reminder of who's where, and I just don't want to leave those folks unsure and kind of without a subcommittee home and assignment.
Yeah. Hear you loud and clear on that. Yeah. Jane, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I guess I would ask all of you, that has felt like the process of articulation of where new counselors go to subcommittees has felt like the role of the steering committee to me, just because there has been a preference to over-represent on some subcommittees. And I think at this point, you all need to be thinking about clear representation. Both rural resilience and just transitions only have one counselor on them now. Those subcommittees need counselors on them. So whereas other subcommittees have a lot, like cross-sector has a lot of counselors. So I think the original thinking was let counselors self-select based on interest and based on the seat that they're supposed to fill. And I really think the seat that they're supposed to fill should clarify the subcommittee that they're on, the recommendation.
Okay. So folks, we're at the top of the hour and I know we're going to lose folks. I always feel like we could really use another half hour on this. And so let's just, before I jump to Richard, because I know Richard's got a comment he wants to make, just confirming June 12th next meeting, finalize the steering committee there, update on the plan for biomass, and confirmation of what happens for new counselors and subcommittees. And, you know, it almost feels like we could really use just a half hour of you all in steering committee to confirm some of this stuff before June 12th. So we'll test your appetite for doing that before June 12th. Richard, go ahead before we start losing people, please.
We are losing people as it is.
Yeah.
We already have lost a couple of people. I'm Richard Hopkins. I'm a member of the Science and Data Subcommittee, and I am or was a member of the Biomass Task Group for the last year or so. I'm glad y'all are making progress in pulling together a group to move this work forward. I want to make a request that the product that comes from this biomass group should explicitly state what your view is on how bad is burning biomass to make electricity in terms of greenhouse gas production. Is it equivalent to renewable sources like wind or solar, or is it more like coal, which has been suggested by some of the people that came to talk to the biomass work group? Please be explicit about the basis for your recommendation. Do you believe that burning biomass to produce electricity is good or not so good for greenhouse gas emissions? And what is your basis for saying that? I would very much like to see that in the report. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks. And let me just pause to say, anybody else who's been listening in and joining us today, this is a great time to make a quick comment before we finish up today. And apologies for a few minutes late on this, but anybody else who's been listening today want to make a comment? Okay. Jared, last word, and then we got to wrap up here.
It's okay. I just want to respond to Richard first, just to appreciate all of his work on the committees and task groups that he referenced. And I just want to offer that for me, the problem is that I do not have a firm, settled view on this. I think that this is one of the most contested, unsettled areas of science is how you, and I think that there are strong arguments for recognizing that the combustion of biomass is not carbon neutral, but I think there's also strong arguments for recognizing that it is not the same as burning fossil fuels, and the biogenic carbon cycle is different than the fossil or geologic carbon cycle. So, but where you land on that in-between space, to me, it's not, is it good or is it not? It's better than some alternatives. It's worse than other alternatives. And that's for me, I just want to offer, Richard, that that's why I was uncomfortable. It was similar to what David said. Let's do the studies. Let's collect the information so that we can make a more considered view on what the right approach and understanding is, because I don't think that we have the information now, or at least the comfort now, to be able to say, we think it's X or we think it's Y. Because to me, it's really clear that it's an unsettled, contested area in the scientific literature. And it's not a simple black and white issue.
And can I ask,
if I can add just one more thing here.
I would love to take this conversation somewhere else, but I recognize, because this is one of these conversations go on for a while. Richard, if you got 20 seconds, I would love that. And then let's wrap up here.
I understand Jared's point, and the document that we produced reflected that uncertainty, and we were certain enough that biomass was not a good thing that we recommended not building new plants, that we recommended not expanding existing plants, and we came down split on the question of whether the existing plants ought to be closed or not, or at least be phased out over time. That's how we ended up, and that reflects the uncertainty that Jared is talking about. But if you're going to come down one way or the other as to whether the existing biomass plants ought to be closed or not, then you ought to take a position on the science. That's my point.
Super. Okay. All right. Anything else before we wrap up today, folks? And appreciate everybody hanging in there a little over time. Did we get the clarity we needed on next steps? Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you. And steering committee members, just as a quick heads up, we may reach out to you ahead of June 12th. There may be things we need to do, but stay tuned for that. And thanks everyone for the thoughtful contributions today. We'll capture this in some notes and send this around and act on these next steps. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.